Good afternoon. This is the video session for the lecture on the practice of interpretation. And for today, our lecture is text interpretation approaches, processes, and problems. So here is the plan for today. We have four main topics that we need to touch upon. First is types of information in the text. Second is the process of reading and the problem of meaning. Third, approaches to text interpretation. And fourth, problems of interpreting texts. Now, let's start with topic number one. The information contained in a text is its content. The information conveyed by a text may be of different kinds. Those kinds are content conceptual and content factual. First is content conceptual information. It is that which reveals the formation of notions, ideas, or concepts. It is not confined to merely imparting facts, descriptions, events, etc. It is not always easily discernible, may not lie on the surface of its verbal exposition. It may only be grasped after a minute examination of the constituents of the text, provided that the reader has acquired the skill of supralinear analysis. It may have various interpretations and not frequently reveals divergent views as to its purpose. It may be encountered in the Bell's letters and some other functional styles in diplomatic texts. The second one is content factual information. It's contained in the matter-of-fact styles, such as newspaper styles, in the text of official documents, and in some others. Such a division of information may emphasize the crucial difference between what is more or less clearly stated in verbal chains and what is only suggested and therefore needs mental effort to get at what is said by the unsaid. Now, Galperin suggests the following procedures in stylistic analysis, which will facilitate the process of disclosing the kind of information contained in the given text. First, determining the kind of text being dealt with. Taxonomic stage of analysis. There is an immediate need to get a clear idea as to what functional style this or that text belongs and what definite model of a text, such as the style of official documents, a memorandum, etc. Second, content grasping stage. It aims at an approximate understanding of the content of the given text. It does not claim to be a complete and exhaustive penetration into the hidden purpose of the author. And the third one is semantic procedure. Has its purpose the close observation of the meanings of separate words and word combinations, as well as of the significations of the various sentences and supraphrasal units. It's advisable at this stage of analysis to consult dictionaries, in as much as dictionaries will show the polysemy of the words, thus enabling to distinguish a simultaneous realization of two or more meanings of a word in the sentence. Number 4 is the stylistic stage that aims at finding out what additional information might be impaired by the author's use of various stylistic devices. Number 5 is the functional stage that brings us back to the second one and sets the task of investigating the conceptual information contained in the whole of the text. The previously acquired data should be assembled in the kind of synthesis of all procedures should be made. And number 6 is the suggested sequence has proved to be the most efficient in getting a deeper insight into what constitutes the notion text. Now, the next topic we need to consider is humans are meaning-making creatures. We can help trying to make sense of all our experiences, including our reading experiences. So while we are in the process of reading something, we are always engaged in creating meaning from the words. We often remain unaware of this emerging meaning as we read, particularly if we are just reading for pleasure. But if a friend stops us while we are in the middle of reading something and asks us what it means, we can usually make explicit the tentative emerging meaning we have been building in our minds. Reading may look passive. We sit quietly and let the image of the words print itself in our retina and thus pass inward to our brain. But reading is a deeply active process of exploration. In fact, when we have trouble reading, it's often because we have been mistakenly trying to be passive, trying to make ourselves look good on cameras, but since reading doesn't work that way, our performance suffers when we try to operate on that model. Research on reading gives more and more evidence of how quick, active, and complicated the process is, how much goes on below the level of awareness. Since we don't take in meaning, but rather make meaning, we do that making on the basis of all the thoughts, feelings, and experiences already inside us, not just on the basis of words on the page. We are not, of course, born knowing the meanings of words in our native language. We come to know the meanings of words by listening to and observing others. We can't make the word chat mean whatever we want it to mean, but at this point when we use or read the word, we are determining its meaning on the basis of prior personal experiences. The central activity of reading is making of meaning. We tend to think that meaning is out of there, that our task in reading is to discover it, not to make it. But even though it looks as though writers have meanings, which they put into words, and then readers take the meaning out, at the other end, this is an illusion. We don't have a meaning till we have words for it. But even this does not encompass the complexity. Words cannot have or contain meanings, only people can. Words are only meaningful insofar as people attribute meanings to them. In short, words cannot transport a writer's meaning into our heads. They can only give us a set of directions for creating our own meanings in our own heads. Meanings which, if all goes well, will resemble what the writer had in mind. Thus, reading is not finding meaning, but making meaning, not hunting for messages that already exist there, but building messages. If you have the wrong idea of reading, you tend to fail if things go well. Oh goody, I found it, as an Easter egg hunt. And if things don't go well, you feel, oh dear, where did they hide it? When you are having difficulty in reading, it's counterproductive to think of it as a problem in finding a pesky hidden packet. It is better to think of it as a problem in building or creating. Therefore, to help us read better, particularly when we are reading something difficult or our reading is not going well, we need to pay more attention to the process by which we build meanings out of other people's words. We cannot know the rules for building, meaning almost no one does, but we can watch more closely as we go about building meaning. We can learn to be more sensitive and insightful as we read, and perhaps learn to detect what doesn't fit the meaning we're gradually building up. What doesn't fit often provides clues to the need for us to shift our sights a bit. We can learn something about how and why we construct the meaning we do construct. All this we can do instead of just saying, where is the meaning? Where did the writer hide it? Thus, the process of reading is active and exploratory. The meaning of a text is something that is gradually built up in the process of reading. It emerges through fits and starts of guesses about the future based on expectations from the past, your past experiences with these words and these areas of meaning. In short, reading is a messy, imprecise process, but an interesting one. If you understand it better, you can use it better. People have difficulties in reading when they misunderstand the process and try to make it neat, precise, and mechanical. So, a reader learning to interpret should pay more attention to the words on the page and their relationships with each other, and more attention to the richness, the meanings, the reactions, and associations that he brings to words. By being more skilled at the active and exploratory process of making meaning, you will simply understand more. You will be better at seeing the meaning even in very difficult pieces of writing. It is necessary to distinguish between the meaning and the significance of the text. Significance is fixed in its sensual carrier, usually in a word or phrase. Meaning is not reducible to meanings, but can be expressed in meanings and be conveyed with their help. It is consistent with the logic of presentation of the content, with the compositional and logical laws of the structure of the text. The meaning of the text emerges during its creation. The creator of the text adheres to a certain plan of implementation of his intention. Language is the basis from which the meaning of the text is revealed. That is, the language contributes to the design of the meaning. Researchers give different designations for the whole in the text from which the meaning can be derived. However, in all cases, it's emphasized that a statement expressing a complete thought is usual, not a sentence, but a complex syntactic whole, a superphrasal unity, which is based on a certain logical form of thought. The sense of words and word combinations in the text is transformed under the influence of extra-linguistic or extra-textual factors into the meaning, which mismatch of meaning of individual text elements with the meaning becomes clear from the fact that not all recipients perceive the same text in the same way. The meaning of a text is created simultaneously by horizontal and vertical context, and if the horizontal context is unambiguous, the vertical context is a phenomenon whose interpretation depends on many extralinguistic data relating to both the sender and the receiver of the text speech. Background information as part of the vertical context. Assimilated by the speakers of the language of the text, it becomes the background knowledge necessary to properly understand the meaning of the text. Background information lies outside the text. It belongs to the extratextual phenomena, but it's closely connected with the linguistic material of the text, as it's attached to the objectified linguistic units. Therefore, the correct understanding of the text depends not only on the correct understanding of the meaning of the linguistic units, but also on the correct understanding of the vertical context, which depends on the background knowledge of the receiver of the text. Many authors emphasize the need for the reader to have a certain stock, without which it's impossible to perceive and understand the author's thought implicit in the text in its entirety. For reading as a speech activity, the issue of the amount of information available, the complexity of the reader's global conceptual system, or thesaurus, when encountering a text is very important. The meaning of the message depends on what is the thesaurus of the person perceiving the message. That's what information this person has about objects, their properties, relations, and connections between them before receiving as the object of reading this text. Thus, activity with the text begins at the linguistic level and grows into activity at the semantic level. This too cognition is caused by the following: mastery of natural language. Linguistic competence in itself does not yet lead to genuine understanding of any text. Language competence provides, and not always, only perception of meaning, but not the meaning of what we hear or read. Understanding at the level of meaning implies the reader's ability to convey the content of what he or she has read. From this stage of reading comprehension, the student should be led to a more difficult one, that's to understanding at the level of meaning, which implies in-depth study of the text. Now, section number 3. Now, section number 3 is engagement with any text is an interactive process. There's always the implication. What do you mean and why so? There are various things people do when they analyze a text, or indeed analyze any discourse, spoken or written. An analysis of the reasoning, what is the main assertion, the reasons given, and the backing and assumptions that support those reasons. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the reasoning? An analysis of persuasive strategies other than reasoning. An analysis of the voice, tone, diction, and the stance of the writer towards the reader. An analysis of the form, structure, organization, division into parts, and how they relate to the meaning. An analysis of the figurative language. There are two main traditions in the text analysis. First, exploring what effect the text has on the reader and explaining how it achieves that effect. And second, exploring the relationship between what is said and how it's said, between the meaning and the form. Meaning is not a matter of recognition but a realization, not a matter of what a text means, but what a text means to the reader. The very fact that the poem is dislocated from a social context gives license to readers to locate its meaning in their own individual experience. Thus, people will produce diverse and divergent interpretations. We interpret meanings out of texts. The differences of interpretations are conditioned by our particular dispositions, individual experiences of language and reality. And yet, the meanings we read into text are not independent of the texts themselves either. Interpretations must ultimately be referred back to the texts which activated them. The positions that H.G. Widdowson takes is that we neither capture nor create the world with our text, but interact with it. We use our text to interact with the world, both that which is socially sanctioned and that which is individually apprehended. In other words, we interpret texts into discourses in different ways. Stylistic parsing can be done by focusing either on the author or on the reader's perception of the text itself. The first coincides with literary stylistic genetic. The second is represented in the stylistics of decoding. Analysis from the author involves highlighting his features in comparison to the author's. Stylistic from the author is more interested in authors than in their works, treating the work as a kind of consequence to be found. In order to offer a reasonable interpretation of an author's intentions, one must have a good knowledge of the literary, cultural, social, and political setting of the era, other works by the same author, and his creative and personal biography. However, even in the presence of extensive information of the aforementioned nature, guesses about the author's intentions and statements, such as the author wants to say or the author wants to show, this image is introduced for the purpose of, etc., often lead to arbitrary and superficial evaluations. Even the writer himself is far from always able to give sufficiently accurate information about his intentions. The discrepancy between the conscious intention and the result of creation is a common occurrence in the history of literature. The meaning of a poem may be much broader than the author's conscious intention, and very remote from its origins. Stylistic analysis from the author necessarily requires not only knowledge of the facts of the creative biography of the writer, genesis of the work, knowledge of the era in which the work was created and the era it describes, but also the entire history of literature. The artistic work is compared and contrasted with everything that was created before it, assessed within the existing literature and aesthetic tradition. Perceptual stylistics and decoding stylistics consider a literature work as a source of impressions for the reader. Literary and stylistic analysis from the perspective of the recipient of speech, Stepanov calls stylistics of perception. In perceptual stylistics, attention is focused not on the writer, but on the result of his work, on the impact that the text has on the reader, or on the analyzer himself. The principle of feedback plays a very large role in this process. It's essentially any kind of feedback that shows the effectiveness of understanding on the part of the receiver, returning to the sender, and correcting his further activity. The reader recreates the text in his mind rather than creating it anew. Stylistics of decoding as a theoretical basis for the interpretation of the text at its perception teaches to pay attention to the connections within the text, to notice what an unsophisticated reader may miss in it, teaches to form their own opinion about the text. Possible excessive subjectivity is reduced if the reader learns to look for objective linguistic confirmation of his guess in the text. Perceptual stylistics must take both linguistic and literary stylistics into account, because both internal and external contexts are important for interpreting a text. We experience the structures of a literary text as elements of a dynamic communicative interaction between writer and reader, in which our expectations are fulfilled or frustrated. We all have different expectations and emotions, and thus the responses and our interpretation of the text as a whole are bound to differ from reader to a reader. It's impossible to achieve an extensive, the only correct interpretation of a work of fiction, nor can there be one, but it's necessary to prevent incorrect, distorted, or primitive reading comprehension. It's important to learn to see more in the text than without it. There is not and cannot be an optimal and appropriate analysis procedure for every text. However, familiarity with the various possible techniques and the ability to combine them helps one to gain more information when reading. And the last section is insufficient and incomplete understanding is caused by the following reasons. So reason number 1 is isolated perception of separate elements, inability to take into account the influence of the text, of the context, including grammatical features of the construction of the text. Second, lexical difficulties. Inattention to stylistic, emotional, evaluative, expressive connotations. Inattention to unusual word combinations. Misunderstanding of the words used in rare, outdated, or special meanings. Number 3, superficiality of reading comprehension, inability to notice the author's attitude towards the depicted, his irony or sarcasm, insensitivity to subtext, inability to independently supplement what is not said. And number 4 is bias. The reader often expects that the solution to a problem he or she imagines will coincide with the author's solution. Such a reader finds it difficult to perceive the new, unexpected for themselves. He simplifies and coarsens the text in advance, cannot respond to new thoughts and feelings, simply does not notice them. In this case, reading cannot enrich. For a deep understanding of the text, it's necessary to consider it as a whole. Each individual element is not considered in isolation, but in its connections and relationships with other elements, with the entire structure of the artistic text. The analysis must take into account syntagmatic and paradigmatic connections. So here are the references for this particular lecture. Now we move on to our next topic. Now the second topic that we have for this lesson is the subject of consecutive translation. Here is the plan for this particular lecture. So first we're going to touch upon the oral translation in general, then we're going to review the consecutive translation, and in the third part we will see the difference between the consecutive and simultaneous translation. Now, translation, according to one of the basic classifications, is divided into written and oral, which itself is divided into simultaneous and consecutive interpretation. This classification is reflected in several world languages, emphasizing lexically that oral and written translation mean significantly different processes of intellectual activity, which have totally different approaches. Consecutive oral interpretation is used 10 times more frequently. The speech of the principle is segmented into parts by length of phrase, sentence, or paragraph, graphic equivalents of sound units, so that during a discontinuous pause, the interpreter gives back the content of the spoken segment. Oral interpretation is not as exact as written and requires greater concentration of attention, more careful preparation to make it easy in battle. The interpreter has his code of honor and professional ethics, like the second attitude. He is a diplomat, an ambassador, a psychologist. Unarguably, consecutive interpretation is the more interesting and in-demand subset of this field. So, oral translation, it's included in the services of almost every translation agency. Interpretation is required at conferences, meetings, and in any event involving people that speak different languages. Interpretation is often put in the context of conference, interpreting as it's most often used at conferences. It must be remembered that oral translation is provided by an interpreter and written translation by a translator. When ordering interpretation services, one must always take into account that for a successful performance, at least a 3-week prior notice, preferably even a month advance notice of the event is required. Clients should be as dutiful as possible in ensuring that authors of presentations would send their reports by a given deadline and provide interpreters with necessary materials at least 5 days before the event is due. In case of easier speeches or texts, 2-3 days will also be sufficient. In that way, the interpreter can ensure best results, for there is enough time to go through the subject of presentations, the terms used, the speaker's language use, and other relevant details. With the lack of presentation-related information provided in advance, interpreters may ask a higher price for the simultaneous interpretation. The cost of interpretation is evaluated on a time basis and not the quantity of material translated. Thus, it's possible to pay for the interpreter's work by the hour or the day, while written translation is valued by the number of pages or words. If the interpreter does not participate in the oral process for certain portions of the contracted time period, the cost for his work is not reduced, and the words but the interpreter was silent almost the whole time is not an argument and does not serve as the basis for a discount. In choosing an agency to provide you with interpretation services, it's always worthwhile to pay attention to whether or not there are a sufficient number of staff interpreters working in your field. Now, consecutive translation. During consecutive interpreting, the speaker stops every 1 to 5 minutes, usually at the end of every paragraph or complete thought, and the interpreter then steps in to render what was said into the target language. A key skill involved in consecutive interpreting is note-taking, since few people can memorize a full paragraph in one hearing without loss of detail. Interpreters' notes are very different from those of, say, a stenographer, because writing down words in the source language makes the interpreter's jobs harder when he has to translate the speech into the target language. Many professional interpreters develop their own ideogrammic symbology, which allows them to take down not the words, but the thoughts of the speaker in a sort of language-independent form. Then the interpreter's output is more idiomatic and less source language bound. Full or unbroken consecutive interpreting of whole thoughts allow for the full meaning of the source language message to be understood before the interpreter renders it in the target language. This affords a truer, more accurate, more accessible interpretation than does simultaneous interpretation. The only case in which the technique of consecutive interpretation cannot be applied is when a written speech is being read out. Written speeches are best dealt with by the reading of pre-translated texts. In consecutive interpreting, the interpreter speaks after the source language speaker completed 1 or 2 complete sentences. The speech is divided into segments, and the interpreter sits or stands beside the source language speaker, listening and taking notes as the speaker progresses through the message. When the speaker pauses or finishes speaking, the interpreter then renders a portion of the message, or the entire message in the target language. Consecutive interpretation is rendered as short CI or short CI or long CI. In short CI, the interpreter relies on memory, each message segment being brief enough to memorize. In long CI, the interpreter takes note of the message to aid rendering long passages. These informal divisions are established with the client before the interpretation is effected, depending upon the subject, its complexity, and the purpose of the interpretation. On occasion, document side translation is required of the interpreter during consecutive interpretation work. Side translation combines interpretation and translation. The interpreter must render the source language document to the target language, as if it were written in the target language. Side translation occurs usually, but not exclusively, in judicial and medical work. Consecutively interpreted speeches, or segments of them, tend to be short. 50 years ago, the CI interpreter would render speeches of 20 or 30 minutes. Today, 10 or 15 minutes is considered too long, particularly since audiences usually prefer not to sit through 20 minutes of speech they cannot understand. Often, if not previously advised, the source language speaker is unaware that they may speak more than a single sentence before the CI interpretation is rendered and might stop after each sentence to await its target language rendering. Sometimes, however, depending upon the setting or subject matter and upon the interpreter's capacity to memorize, the interpreter may ask the speaker to pause after each sentence or after each clause. Sentence-by-sentence interpreting requires less memorization and therefore a lower likelihood for omissions. Yet its disadvantage is in the interpreters not having heard the entire speech or its gist, and the overall message is sometimes harder to render, both because of lack of context and because of interpreter delivery. For example, imagine a joke told in bits and pieces with breaks for translation in between. This method is often used in rendering speeches, depositions, recorded statements, court witness testimony, and medical and job interviews. But it's usually best to complete a whole idea before it's interpreted. Now, part 3, the difference between consecutive and simultaneous translation. Consecutive interpreting. Speaker's text is interpreted usually by time slots of 5 to 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the difficulty of the text. Interpreting by shorter phases is also called parroting. Consecutive interpretation requires no special equipment. Interpreters use their notes taken during the speech. Simultaneous interpreting. Interpretation is performed at interpreter's booth simultaneously with the speaker's presentation, and the text in the target language reaches the listeners through special headphones. There are normally at least 2 interpreters in the interpreter's booth, since one interpreter cannot interpret for more than half an hour on a continuous basis. And also whispered interpreting, similar to simultaneous interpretation, in that the interpretation takes place simultaneously with the speaking, but is characterized by no requirement of special equipment, and the interpretation is whispered only to a few people. In whispered interpreting, sometimes called whispering simultaneous, the interpreter sits or stands next to the person or people requiring interpretation. A maximum of 2 people can be accommodated, unless a microphone and headphones are used. The interpreter does not whisper, as this would after a time be taxing on voice, making further speech impossible due to the hoarseness whispering for long periods induces. Instead, the interpreter speaks softly using normal voiced speech, kept at a low volume. The interpreter's mouth and the ear of the person listening must be in close proximity, so as not to disturb the others in the room. Without electronic equipment, talkative is tiring as the interpreter's posture is affected. Simultaneous interpreting is used when people need to follow what is said in the room without themselves making a contribution, whereas consecutive interpretation is used when there is a dialogue and perhaps people wish to hear what the original speaker said in the source language because some of the listeners speak that language, or in a court setting to preserve for the record the original words of the speaker when a witness or other party is questioned. Media. By its very nature, media interpreting has to be conducted in the simultaneous mode. It's provided particularly for live television coverages, such as press conferences, live or taped interviews with political figures, musicians, artists, sportsmen, or people from the business circle. In this type of interpreting, the interpreter has to sit in a soundproof booth where ideally he or she can see the speakers on a monitor and the set. All equipment should be checked before recording begins. In particular, satellite connections have to be double-checked to ensure that the interpreter's voice is not sent back and the interpreter gets to hear only one channel at a time. In the case of interviews recorded outside of the studio and some current affairs program, the interpreter interprets what he or she hears on a TV monitor. Background noise can be a serious problem. The interpreter working for the media has to sound as slick and confident as a television presenter. Media interpreting has gained more visibility and presence, especially after the Gulf War. Television channels have begun to hire staff simultaneous interpreters. The interpreter renders the press conferences, telephone beepers, interviews, and similar live coverage for the viewers. It's more stressful than other types of interpreting, as the interpreter has to deal with a wide range of technical problems, coupled with control room's hassle and wrangling during live coverage. Now, modalities of interpreting. Interpreting services can be delivered in multiple modalities. The most common modality through which interpreting services are provided is on-site interpreting. On-site interpreting, also called in-person interpreting, or sometimes colloquialized as face-to-face. This delivery method requires the interpreter to be physically present in order for the interpretation to take place. In on-site interpreting settings, all of the parties who wish to speak to one another are usually located in the same place. This is by far the most common modality used for most public and social service settings. Now, the last part of our lesson is about sign language interpretation. So, a sign language interpreter must accurately convey messages between two different languages. An interpreter is there for both deaf and hearing individuals. The act of interpreting occurs when a hearing person speaks, and an interpreter renders the speaker's meaning into sign language, or other forms used by the deaf parties. The interpreting also happens in reverse, when a deaf person signs, and interpreter renders the meaning expressed in the signs into the oral language for the hearing party, which is sometimes referred to as voice interpreting or voicing. This may be performed either as simultaneous or consecutive interpreting. Skilled sign language interpreters will position themselves in a room or space that allows them to be seen by the deaf participants and heard clearly by the hearing participants, as well as be in position to hear and/or see the speaker or speakers clearly. In some circumstances, an interpreter may interpret from one language to another, whether that's English to British Sign Language, English to American Sign Language, Spanish to English to American Sign Language, and so on. Deaf individuals also have the opportunity to work as interpreters. The deaf individual will team with the hearing counterpart to provide interpretation for deaf individuals who may not know the same sign language used in that country, who have minimal language skills, are developmentally delayed, or have other mental and/or physical disabilities, which make communication a unique challenge. In other cases, the hearing interpreter may interpret in the sign language, whichever kind of sign language the team knows, and the dev team will then interpret into the language in which the individual can understand. They also interpret information from one medium of language into another. For example, when a person is signing visually, the deaf interpreter could be hired to copy those signs into a deaf blind person's hand and add visual information. Most interpreters have been formally trained in an Interpreter Training Program, or ITP. ITP lengths vary and are usually 2 or 4 years to obtain a degree or certificate. Graduate programs are also available. In the United States, sign language interpreters have national and state level certifications. The Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, a non-profit organization, is known for its national recognition and certification process. In addition to training requirements and stringent certification testing, the RID members must abide by a code of professional conduct, grievance process, and continuing education requirement. There are many interpreter training programs in the US. A collegiate commission on interpreter education is the body that accredits interpreter preparation programs. So that is it for this lesson. Thanks for your attention.